world of the arts, the remarkable fact has very often been noted that what we still think of as modern painting and modern music and modern poetry and the modern novel all developed, roughly speaking, simultaneously. They all got going in the early years of this century and first became fashionable in about the 1920s. And in all the arts, modernism has had some strikingly similar consequences. For instance, in each of the arts there was a turning away from the unself-conscious depiction of the world, or of experience, and a turning in on itself. Art actually became its own subject matter. That's to say, it became familiar for, say, the subject of a poem to be the process of writing a poem, or the difficulties of being a poet. Ditto with plays and novels, and later even films. Music and painting, too, in their different ways, exhibited the same concern with their own innards, and very often turned them into their own subject matter, and put them on display. In all the arts, too, and perhaps this is related to the last point, there was a disintegration of traditional forms, a tendency to build new structures and to build them out of small, carefully shaped fragments. I'm emphasizing this because all this is true, and with remarkable exactitude, of philosophy as well, a fact which illustrates how deeply embedded the development of philosophy is in the cultural matrix of its time. Modern philosophy can be said to have started in 1903 with the breakaway of G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell from the idealism which had dominated the 19th century, and then, after the pioneering work of Russell, followed by that of Wittgenstein, who was a pupil of Russell, there developed in the 1920s in Austria the first fully fledged school devoted to the new philosophy, a school which was known as the Vienna Circle. To the philosophy they developed they gave the name logical positivism, and for a long time afterwards that label was attached to modern philosophy generally in the minds of very many laymen. The person who introduced logical positivism into England was A.J. Ayer, and his is the name that has been chiefly associated with it ever since in this country. He did so in a still very famous and widely read book called Language, Truth and Logic, which he published in January 1936 when he was only 25. It's very much a young man's book, explosively written, and it's still the best short guide to the central doctrines of logical positivism. The aggressiveness of that book was typical of the movement as a whole. They self-consciously organized themselves like a political party, with regular meetings and publications and international congresses, and they propagated their doctrines with missionary zeal. If we look at the question of what they were fighting against so passionately and why, I think that will provide us with the clearest starting point for our consideration of logical positivism. And then we'll be in a better position to go on and examine their own doctrines. Professor Ayer, what was it that the logical positivists were campaigning so passionately against?
Well, primarily they were against metaphysics, what they call metaphysics, and that was any suggestion that there might be a world going beyond the ordinary world of science and common sense, the world revealed to us by our senses. Already Kant, at the end of the 18th century, had said it was impossible to have any knowledge of anything that wasn't within the realm of possible sense experience, but these Viennese people went further. They said that any statement that wasn't either a formal statement, like a statement of logic or mathematics, or one that was empirically testable, was simply nonsensical. And so they cut away, therefore, all metaphysics in that sense. And this had some further implications. It was, for example, obviously a condemnation of any theology, any notion of there being a transcendent God. And this, although they were themselves not politically conscious, with one exception, there was one of them who was, but only one, a man called Otto Neurath, had political implications, because there was in Vienna at that time a rather bitter struggle between the socialists and a right-wing clerical party headed by Dollfuss, and the opposition of the Vienna Circle to Metaphysics was in part a political act, even though they weren't themselves primarily concerned with politics.
Now, you mentioned one of them by name, Otto Neurath.
Yes.
Since we're going to be talking about this circle of people, I think it'll be helpful if we get clear who the main individuals were. Who were they?
Well, the chief person, the leader of the circle, the official leader of the circle, was a man called Moritz Schlick, who was originally a German, and he came to Vienna at the age of about 40, in the early 1920s, in his early 40s. And he had, like most of them, or many of them, had been trained originally as a physicist and was interested mainly in the philosophy of physics. And in fact, one of the leading traits of the circle is the extreme reverence for natural sciences. And Schlick was their chairman, and he took up his chair in the middle 20s and started organizing the circle, I think, almost the moment he arrived there. Then the next most important person was another German called Rudolf Carnap, and he had been a pupil of the great German logician Frege. He'd been a pupil of Frege in Jena, and he came to Vienna a few years after Schlick in the late 1920s, and in fact left Vienna in the early 30s for Prague, but was still a very powerful influence in the movement. He was the chief contributor to their journal, which was a journal called Erkenntnis. The third person was a man I've already mentioned called Neurath. I think he was an Austrian, but he was the most active of them politically, and in fact did have some post in the revolutionary Spartacist government in Munich after the First World War. And he was very nearly a Marxist. He wanted to combine positivism and Marxism, and it was he who was mainly conscious of it as a political movement. He wanted to organize it politically.
Now, it's obvious from what you said that this was a radically revolutionary movement. I mean, they were destructive of established ideas in religion, destructive of established ideas in politics, and above all, destructive of established ideas in the German philosophical tradition. And I suppose that the two main scalpels that they used to tear away what they regarded as all that diseased or dead intellectual tissue were logic and science, hence the name logical positivism.
Indeed. It wasn't quite so novel as all that. It was continuing an old, previous Viennese tradition. There was a scientist and a philosopher of science called Ernst Mach. He's the man against whom Lenin wrote his Materialism and Empiricism, who flourished in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. He was a professor in Prague from about the 1860s onwards, then came to Vienna. And it was he who took the view of science that, for example, Schlick also took, that it must deal, in the last resort, simply with human sensations. Since all our knowledge of scientific facts comes through our senses, then Mach reasoned that in the last resort, science must simply be a description of sensation. And this was the Viennese people took over. And, of course, they were following an old empiricist tradition. Although they didn't themselves know or care much about the history of philosophy, what they said was very like what was said by the English philosopher, Scottish philosopher, David Hume, in the 18th century. So to that extent, they weren't all that novel, they weren't all that revolutionary. What was revolutionary was, in a sense, their fervour and their seeing this as putting philosophy on a new road. They thought that here at last we've now discovered what philosophy is going to be. It's going to be the handmaiden of science. It wasn't so much that they used science in their philosophy as that they thought that the whole field of knowledge was taken up by science. I mean, science describes the world. The only world there is this world, the world of things around us and so on, and this is what science describes. And there isn't any other domain for philosophy to occupy itself with. Therefore, what can it do? All it can do is analyze and criticize the theories, the concepts of science. This is how science came in. Logic came in as supplying them with a tool. Logic had remained pretty much stagnant since the days of Aristotle, and then at the beginning of the 19th century, it took a move forward. There were some precursors, there were Boole and De Morgan, but the real jump came at the end of the 19th century with Frege in Germany, and as we ourselves said earlier, Russell and Whitehead in England. And this generalized logic more widely than had been done. It didn't actually refute Aristotle. They showed that Aristotle was just a little corner of logic, but they had lived there a much more wide-reaching, far-ranging logic, which provided them with a very powerful tool of analysis. It enabled them to express things much more precisely. And since they were very interested in structure, since they thought that science was largely concerned with structure, with relations between things, the development originally by Schroeder and Peirce in the 19th century, and by Russell and Whitehead in the 20th, of logic of relations gave them a tool. It gave them a tool of philosophical analysis.